So, Dr. Fasanella, with all of the with environmental problems such as poverty, such as malnutrition, such as climate change, such as meat consumption, where do you see the future of sustainability going? If you had all power, if you had tremendous influence for the global community, what would you do? Or what do you think needs to be done to sort of have a livable planet?
I think that the first thing needs to be done is a critique of the status quo, because I think the biggest problem is that people feel that the way they're living now is the way, either the way that we have always lived as a species, or that it's some kind of a pinnacle of evolution, that we've reached some kind of special place where we've climbed up this mountain and we've reached the top and we have all of this special knowledge. And I think the truth is far different. I think the truth is that there's a lot of knowledge we don't have, a lot of essential knowledge that we don't have, a lot of knowledge that we lost, that our ancestors had. There are things we know that they didn't know, but there are also things they knew that we don't know. For instance, how connected we are to all other living things. We know about more specific species than they know about, but they knew about their connection to other species in a much more intimate and direct way than we do. So I think the first thing that we would need to do is have some kind of a massive education program that would critique the status quo, that would critique our economic systems, that would critique our sense of self and individuality, that would critique our sense of wealth, the notion of wealth, that would critique the concept of growth, which is seen as a good thing. So I think that's the number one thing, is to actually look at the status quo, look at how things are, and then break down all of the problems. So let me just stick with growth. Can I do that for a minute? This growth is always seen as a panacea. It's like, if we just can grow our economy, then we'll be fine as a nation, we'll be fine as a country. If we can grow our personal economy in our households, then we'll be fine. We'll reach some place of sustainability, or reach some place where we can just go on and on forever. Which is the notion behind pension systems and everything, is that you can kind of reach this state where it'll just become self-perpetuating. But if you look at how nature actually exists, there is nothing that's self-perpetuating. Everything's in a constant state of flux and constantly evolving. So that notion of achieving this perfect state is flawed. But it's at the core of our whole notion of human existence. It's like, we can keep growing our knowledge, grow our medical technology, grow... And we'll just get to the point where we can eradicate all disease. That doesn't work that way. The more we know how little we know. And disease will just keep evolving at the rate that we keep evolving cures. Which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to cure things. It's just that we should change our fundamental notion that we're going to beat this thing. We're not going to beat it. We have to learn how to integrate our practices with the natural world in which we live. We're never going to beat it. It doesn't work that way.
So that's growth, but so would you see things such as LED light bulbs and solar panels and wind turbines? Most people would see those as a good thing, but that's the growth model.
That's we're going to invent this technology that's going to solve our problem. So I have a colleague who I have tremendous respect for, who is just so in awe of the power of the sun, because there's so much energy coming from the sun. I mean, in a matter of moments, more energy comes from the sun than we can use an entire year. So if you took all human beings on Earth and said took all their energy needs, in just moments you can fulfill all their needs if we knew how to harvest it. Well, we do harvest it. Nature harvests it all the time. That's how plants grow. That's photosynthesis, and that's how our air, that's how our water gets purified, because it evaporates and then rains down and goes through an aquifer. So we're harvesting that sunlight all the time as collectively, as all living beings on Earth. I mean, that's working for us at all times. So we have this notion of, we just invent the right technology to harvest it, then we'll have all the energy we ever need. But if you look at the statistics, the more technology we develop to harvest the sun, the more energy we use. It becomes an excuse for using more energy. So we're putting all these photovoltaic panels online now, and there's companies out there putting them on people's roofs and residential houses. But if you look at it, our energy use is going up. And of course, they're not recyclable, from what I understand, these photovoltaic cells. And also, I think China has more than 90% of the market. And if you look at China's industrial practices and you look at their water pollution and their air pollution, it's clear that producing these photovoltaic panels is unsustainable from a environmental pollution perspective. So that's a classic example. If we were really looking at it rationally, we would say, all right, we've got a problem with polluting our atmosphere using fossil fuels, whether it's coal or whatever. So instead of trying to invent a new technology so we can have the same amount of energy, or what actually happens in practice, more energy, we should be looking at technologies that use less energy, like living closer to work, restructuring society so that we're not using vehicles to go to work, so that we're actually able to walk to work. We've had many societies that accomplished that. The Egyptians accomplished it and had a sustainable society for a couple thousand years. The Romans accomplished it, had a sustainable society for a couple hundred years before they became unsustainable. And then medieval kingdoms, you know, some of them had this kind of sustainable way of living near a market village, a medieval city. So, but we have this notion in the 21st century that somehow we've evolved to this perfect state and we're going to invent these special machines that are going to get us to and from and be zero carbon. Once again, that's not how nature works. There is no such thing as zero carbon. You can't, you know, anything that you produce is going to have some effect. Anything new is going to have some effect on the environment. So the number one thing is to say, you know, how can we look at our practices? So we know how to build passive solar buildings that once they're built don't need any additional light during daylight hours, even on cloudy days, unless it's like a really dark thunderstorm. But then if it's a really dark thunderstorm, most people aren't doing a hell of a lot anyway, so we don't necessarily need that light. You know, looking at our work hours. Why are we working 24 hours? Why are we working 7 days a week and 24 hours? And why are we checking emails at 1 o'clock in the morning? And, you know, that's, if we look at all those practices, that's going to have a much more dramatic impact on our energy use than producing all the photovoltaic panels in the world, which, at least from what we see happening in the world today, is producing more pollution and producing all of this future landfill. Because the photovoltaic panels last for 25 years, they're unrecyclable, and then they're going to be landfill. And then if they're being produced in China, which is infamous for its lack of safety regulations and lack of oversight and inspection on its industry, we don't even know if they're going to last 25 years. Maybe they'll last 5, maybe they'll last 50. But in any event, the more technology we produce, the more energy we end up using. It's just like with highways. The wider we make the highways, the more cars end up using them. So we should say, how do we create societies with less cars? You know, how do we create buildings that use less energy, that don't need any lighting, that don't need any heating systems? And we can do that with passive solar in the Northeast. So that's the idea. So and we should embrace the notion of a decaying society, of a society getting smaller and maybe using less buildings. That's what's happening in Detroit. That's what's happening in Youngstown, Ohio. It's not a bad thing. It's just evolution. You know, we have this notion that unless it's growing, it's bad. But look at our own bodies. We can't grow indefinitely. That's what's giving us diabetes. It's because we're trying to eat and eat and eat and grow indefinitely, essentially. You know, so you can see it right in your own body. There's limits to growth, and at a certain point you have to check yourself, and then as you get older, you decay, and you have to accept that and embrace that as an individual, and we have to do it collectively as a society.
So you're saying that it's not a technological fix. It's more of a looking at our behavioral patterns and assessing those and seeing what works and what doesn't.
Right. When I was in college, I was exposed to Buckminster Fuller's ideas by one of my design professors. And Buckminster Fuller had, at that time, a definition for environmental design. He said, not only inventing, building, and planning for a better physical environment for mankind, but reforming behavioral patterns in a community. And I think that's, do we need new technologies? Absolutely. And we're human beings. We have this innate drive to make things. We're not going to stop people from inventing. We're not going to stop, which inventing, by the way, is actually just discovering things that exist in nature and finding ways to apply them to our own needs. That's what technology is. It's just, you know, food is a technology, or cupping your hand and using it to drink water out of a stream. That's a technology. I mean, anytime we discover something that exists in nature, we cup our hand, we can make a vessel, and then we can drink. That's just discovering that thing in nature and then applying it to our needs is a technology. So human beings are that type of a species. Like there are some other species that use tools, and they're not going to stop using tools. It's not something you can erase from your mindset. Maybe even with a lobotomy, it's kind of the thing that we're just wired to do. So we're going to have new technologies, but we're also social beings, highly social beings, and we have social norms. And those social norms do far more to affect change in how we create our built environment than the technologies do. The technologies, living in cities was a technology that happened thousands and thousands of years ago, and that changed. What's chicken and the egg? Which changed first? That the tribes became bigger and started to specialize labor, and then needed cities, or they started to, dwell in closer proximity and be able to stay in a more stable place, and then cities arose. It doesn't really matter, but what we do know is that those social norms have a huge impact on the built environment. And so, yes, we need to change those social norms. We have to, like I was talking to my son this morning, and last night we went to a restaurant and he got a chicken pot pie, and it was awful for a lot of reasons, but the quality of the chicken was one of them. It was kind of this weird, tasteless stuff, which much chicken is now because it's produced in this industrial system. And he said, well, why should I care about the chicken? And I said, well, that's because that's the whole point. I mean, if we're producing these huge lakes of waste from chicken production and pig production and cattle production, and we're using up more land, for cattle production than we use for anything else, essentially. So that's why we should care. So if we breed some cow that can live on, the head of a pin, so that we can have beef. That's really not the answer. Is to put all our effort into trying to breed some cow that can live on the head of a pin. What the real answer is to say, what is it that we need as a collectively society to be comfortable? We need a certain amount of heat and warmth. If we live in a cold climate, we need a certain amount of food. We need love. We need time to relax and enjoy each other. I mean, those are some basic essential things. Do we really need, a new cell phone every 3 months or a Prius? Or we don't need most of these things. So, but we're constantly saying that we're at some pinnacle of technology, and we're going to get to this point where we just get it right, And you often hear conservative politicians when they're challenged with the environmental problems and the social problems. Like, for instance, in 1970 we had 300,000 people in prison. Now we have 2.3 million people in prison, and it's as a percentage of the American population, it's a much higher percentage. And they'll say, yes, but we know we're incredibly ingenious, and we'll find the right way, we'll find the right technology, we'll find the right type of prisoner. But that's not the answer. The answer is fundamentally going backwards and saying, all right, why are these people ending up in prison in the first place? And do we even need prisons? The Quakers, who invented the notion of prison, now say, no, this was a mistake. We don't need prisons. We need to kind of back up. And so that's what I think we need to do. It's not a technological fix that'll solve the problem. It's one of my students that said that, we have to stop and let history catch up with us, or let us catch up with history, before we keep rushing headlong into the future. So we'll have people develop new technology, because there will always be people who want to develop new technology. That's just part of being human. But collectively, as a society, we have to critique our society, like the French did when they had the French Revolution, or like the Americans did when they had the American Revolution. They fundamentally critiqued the society in which they lived and tried to come up with new practices for structuring society. That wasn't about technology. That was, how do we structure society? Does monarchy make sense? Should we have a monarchy? Those are fun. That's a very fundamental question. So now we have to ask the question: should we have the notion of profit? If we have profit, when we don't recognize that something has to be a loss. If there's a profit, you can't have profit without a loss somewhere else. Well, that's unsustainable. So that's fundamentally the question. Much more so than we're going to make profits off of the perfect technology. Then it's automatically a flawed system. So that, yes, I think you're right. It's not a technology that'll solve the problem. It's a social consciousness and a collective social effort to address this. Like we addressed public education. There are things that we've done that are correct. Are there flaws with public education now? Yes. Should we throw away the notion that people should be educated? No. I think that if you look at population growth, you see that the more educated people are, the less children they have. So if we have a problem where we want to stabilize and have some kind of sustainability in our population, well, then we have to educate people. That's clear. So that's what I mean by changing social practices. It's probably going to do more to affect the climate than inventing a new technology.
A lot of people, even my age, in college, are jaded already and say that nothing is going to change. This is how things always have been, or this is, like you were saying, this is not the pinnacle, but a lot of people believe that it is. And I know my own brother says that, he hates Long Island, but there's no other choice for him, because you look at any place we've paved over the United States, got rid of its natural beauty, and made it flat, and put in suburbia with strip malls and highways.
Farms to feed cattle with grain.
Right. So, basically, what would you say to people that think that way, or think that there's no hope?
Well, I think that hopelessness, and it's one of those funny things. I was listening to a thing on the radio. I always have a tendency to chuckle after I say something. I make some pointed comment, then I'll laugh. And I have a friend who says, you really shouldn't do that because it takes away from the strength of your argument. But I heard on the radio this morning, some psychologist said that laughing is a way of showing that you're not defeated. And so I think that what ends up happening is you have to reach a certain point of kind of black humor about the future. You have to recognize the situation has to be bad, and it is bad. I mean, there are many great things. Am I happy that I'm able to take a hot shower and use a flush toilet? Absolutely. Those are things that I wouldn't necessarily want to give up, and I don't think we have to give them up, because there are solar water heaters, and there are sustainable practices we could use to generate hot water on a localized level, as opposed to this big decentralized or centralized way that we have a tendency to generate energy and then use it to make hot water. So there are things about this society that give us hope, because we do have social safety net to some extent. To the extent that we have a social safety net and we care about each other as a species, that's a good thing. And that wasn't always the case in some earlier societies, and it isn't the case in all societies today. You have people living in slavery today, and you go around Africa and Bangladesh, you'll see people living in slave conditions. But there are these really fundamental things that are broken, like our whole economy in the United States, our ability to have cheap oil. It's much cheaper here than it is anywhere else on the planet. It's cheaper here, I believe, than it is in the Middle East. It's certainly cheaper here than it is in Europe, and it is I believe, in China. Our ability to have these cheap consumer products and cheap electronics and in all these inexpensive things that give us a high standard of living, but a very low quality of life. We're overworked, we're overweight, we have diabetes and heart disease. I heard a statistic the other day that 1 out of every 2 men will get cancer, 1 out of every 3 women will get cancer. Those are things that don't happen in other cultures. And the research shows that the more westernized, the more based in big farming, corporate agriculture, the more that a culture shifts in that direction, we live longer and we have lots of gadgetry and comfortable clothes, but we suffer longer in the sense of our personal health and our emotional well-being. There are people who are very, very poor and happy, and aren't plagued by diseases and heart disease and diabetes and obesity at the same rate. But the more we westernize, the more they become that way. The more they get our diseases of wealth, so to speak, as Colin Campbell calls them. So we do have a very broken system, and I think at some point, I think now it's actually just starting, because if China was this most recent model of growth, it grew at a completely unprecedented rate as a market economy. It's still called a communist country, but it's essentially a market economy. and it's grown at this completely unprecedented rate. So you can see in that example, about 80% of the surface water is polluted. The air is polluted to the extent that it's now starting to affect air quality in California. That really shows you that something's radically wrong with the system. We're not seeing it here because we're benefiting from those cheap imports. And this whole era that has young people feeling like this is the way it has always been has really only been since 1950. It's only been since World War II that you had this tremendous industrial growth and the beginning of this completely petroleum-based economy and a car-based economy. That's what we're exporting to other countries and showing us the model. But we already know it won't work in the sense that all Indians cannot live at the standard of living in terms of gadgetry and cars and highways that we're living, and a 1 hour or more commute to work. It just won't work with all Indians, all Chinese, all Africans. Africa is one of the world's largest growing populations. Nigeria's Lagos is one of the fastest growing cities. And if you go to Lagos, I haven't been there, but I've seen footage. I mean, it's without a tremendous amount of infrastructure. So if it was to put in all that infrastructure and the cars and the highways and all of the stuff that we have in our high standard of living, then we'll pollute the environment in the same way that China's being polluted. I mean, we see it happening in China. So the system that we have now is ending by its own, the scale of the problems inherent with growth, never even recognizing that decay exists. And of course the decay in this case is air quality and water quality. So, you can't run the entire world as an economy, and we've now transitioned to this kind of global economy. So you can't run the world economy based on this perpetual level of growth. It's going to change. And you're going to see people who are in really desperate situations. And it is starting to become more desperate in the United States. We have the highest disparity in income since 1928 between the wealthy and the poor. People who, like myself, who are professionals, are no longer able to afford homes, which was the kind of the standard since 1950. Is owning a home was like a really important thing to say that you had a growing economy. Well, that's declining. There's fewer and fewer affordable homes. We have this tremendous amount of investment from people who are profiting from China and buying, profiting from all this trade and cheap Chinese imports, which is degrading the Chinese economy. So you see what I'm saying? It's become this very unsustainable situation, and it is starting to fail. It's failing because of the environmental pollution. It's failing because all of the essential markers of what is a successful economy, being able to purchase your own home, having your income grow, being able to achieve some kind of security in your retirement, those things are all starting to vanish. And your generation, feels hopeless because you think nothing will change. But that's when you have to look back at what happened right after the World War II and what happened with the WPA after the Depression, where there were these huge campaigns, or what happened right at the turn of the century when they created public education, or the French Revolution, or these huge transformative times where things became so difficult that we did come up with different social norms. And I think that's what we're on the verge of doing. And you have to beware, because the people who have a personal self-interest in getting I love the intellectual property, patenting intellectual property. I mean, that just is a crime in its phrase. You can patent and you can publish a book and share the ideas with somebody, make a few dollars off the publishing rights, but that you can actually own an idea is kind of madness. The ideas are out there in the ether, and as I said, everything exists in nature. Anything that we discuss is already somehow already in the cosmos around us. We're just a part of this complex living, this ecosphere that we dwell in. So to say that I came up with this and therefore I should derive all profit from it is a kind of madness. So we've become kind of rococo and grotesque, like the French kings were, Louis the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and our accessorizing our wealth, and having apartment buildings with elevators that can bring your Lamborghini up to the living room on the 50th floor. It's madness. And patenting and making those profits off of pharmaceuticals that are supposedly to help people with health problems, and have your Lamborghini coming up to it's madness. It's a kind of grotesque Rococo, in other words, it's just this overly ornamented, overly decorous system that we've developed, and it will fail. It has to fail of its own weight, like monarchy did, and like other kind of despotic systems that sought to only extract without ever looking at how they were part of an entire system. So I think your generation is going to see that they don't want their children to get cancer. 1 out of every 2 men, 1 out of every 3 women. There's a point where people become parents and like, it doesn't matter how many accessories I have or how hot my shower is. I don't want my child to get cancer, and so I think that's what will change it. Is that it'll become a problem to the extent that people will recognize it, like they refuse to pay taxation, in the United States, the American Revolution, and there will be those people like the founders and the people in the French Revolution, Diderot, Rousseau, the Enlightenment. That's what happens. Is this, and those were not about technologies. Technology is part of it, but those were fundamental transformations of how we perceive the human condition. And of course, now we've come to realize it's not only about the human condition, but it's about how the human condition is integrated into the world that sustains us, which we didn't think that way before. There was a limitless notion of water and ice and air and earth, and there is a limitless amount of water, ice, and air and earth. What's not limitless is our ability to extract from it without recognizing the effect it'll have on those things.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Hope it makes sense.